Our past shapes who we are to begin with and who we end up becoming later. Our destinies are forged by the circumstances in which we are born, by who our parents are, by when and where the story begins. My own story has involved movement across countries and continents, and it is peppered by tragedy, trauma, and confusion, by deep ruptures, major adjustments, false starts, and continual renewal. It has been the unlikeliest of journeys. My grandfather, Hashi Mohamed, was born around 1930 to a nomadic family nearly 400 kilometers north of Mogadishu, in the wilderness of what was then an Italian colony. My father, Mohammed Hashi Omar, had little formal education and left his family to seek his fortunes in Kenya in the late 1970s. A few years later, he met my mother, a divorcee with 6 children from her previous marriage, who had left her children in Somalia and come to Kenya alone in 1980 to seek a new beginning. She was never formally educated and has never learned how to read and write. I was born in Nairobi on the 10th of September 1983 in the Radiant Health Clinic. Though we were very poor, I remember it as an idyllic time spent in a small community where I knew everybody and everybody knew me. School lasted a total of about 3 years. You had to pay to go, and it cost even more to bribe teachers to ensure that your child got extra attention. Classrooms were generally crowded, equipment was basic, and there was a cane in the hand of most teachers. Looking back, I realized that my classmates and I were abjectly poor by modern standards, but I never felt it. I don't remember ever going hungry. I don't remember missing the basics. It must be said, though, I don't ever recall getting anything I wanted either. 13 years after my parents met, the Somali state collapsed following a brutal civil war. The whole of my family still remaining in Somalia was uprooted and rendered stateless in Kenya. At the same time, my father died in a car crash. We no longer had any source of income or any family who could help us, and staying in our small Nairobi suburb Eastleigh wasn't an option. The decision was made to split the family, and for me and my 3 older siblings to seek asylum elsewhere. And so, in 1993, aged 9, and knowing nothing at all about Britain, I found myself on a plane to London with my brother Ali and my sisters Shukri and Hamdi. When we arrived, we were settled with my aunt. The following year, my grandmother joined us, and after that we lived as a large family group in the London borough of Brent. All of us were lost in grief, completely adrift, mourning not only our lost loved ones, but our homes and everything we'd ever known. It's a terrible story, but pick any Somali who arrived in Britain in the 1990s, and they'll tell you a similar tale. Decades later, the legacy of this trauma, exacerbated both by a lack of available help and a reluctance on the part of the community to seek it, is still deeply felt, in wounds that manifest themselves in myriad ways, from mental health problems to family rifts, from poor school results to gang membership. But at the same time, I often look at our lives today and wonder at how far we have come. As I was beginning this book, Shukri had just given birth to her first baby boy, also called Hashi. 25 years after our father's death in Nairobi, his first grandson was born in London, England. He will grow up a Londoner, an inhabitant of a vast and global city, and a British citizen. Like all babies, his future contains countless possibilities. And yet, as he takes his first steps into it, he carries with him all the gifts and difficulties bequeathed to him by the story of his family. Poverty is not just about material deprivation. It means a fundamental lack of choice and control over your own life, even in the smallest decisions. When we initially settled in Britain, we received food stamps. These meant that we weren't starving, but the stamps were only good for milk or bread. We couldn't exercise the smallest choice about what we ate. Later on, we were almost as constrained by what we could spend. The only way we could afford enough calories to keep 8 hungry boys quiet was chicken or kebabs from the chicken shop, with nothing left over for fruit or vegetables. Poverty also means social isolation. A 2015 report by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation found that people in poverty are less likely to have mixed, diverse social networks, as well as being less likely to have a majority of friends who are in employment. And it means geographical isolation too. Though we lived in one of the most rich and cultured cities in the world, we never left our immediate neighborhood. Being poor seeps into everything and shapes every thought you have. It lowers your horizons, and the stress it puts you under makes it difficult to plan ahead, think clearly, or make the right decisions. It is extremely hard to escape unscathed. The uprooting and separation of my family, the deaths of our parents and family members, and the severe deprivation we experienced when we settled in England all left a mark on me and my siblings. I vividly remember the mold and the rats that infested our first flat, the shame and confusion we felt when we engaged with authorities, and the horror of knowing as a 9-year-old that my adult relatives were just as lost and confused as we were. Being working class does not, of course, mean a life of deprivation, or that you are doomed to failure as an adult. Even if your class circumstances happen to coincide with material deprivation, your parents may be able to compensate in different ways. I was lucky in that although my childhood was in some ways extremely challenging, my crucial early years were stable. Even after we moved to London, I never remember going to bed hungry or cold. I knew that the adults in the family were trying their best. But regardless of the circumstances of the individual family you are born into, your early years will be shaped by your origins in a particular class or milieu. That parenting styles differ between social classes is well established. In her book Unequal Childhoods, on the lives of young children in America, American sociologist Annette Leroux showed that upper-middle-class parents, those with professional jobs and university degrees, approached raising their children as a project in concerted cultivation. This involves help with homework, conversations over the dinner table, trips to museums or cultural events, and being encouraged to engage with and challenge authority figures like teachers. By contrast, she found working-class parents to be much less interventionist and less involved in their child's relationship with school. In the summer, where privileged children can look forward to a holiday or two, visits to museums, zoos and galleries, for disadvantaged children, the summer holidays often represent a vast swathe of nothing to do at all. For my siblings and me, the holidays were a long period of structureless boredom and idleness, with few options other than playing football or video games. When concertedly cultivated children reach adulthood, they have one great advantage. They are entering a system that is designed by people like their parents, for people like them. One aspect of this is that in universities and professional environments, a store of cultural capital, the wealth of experiences, reference points, and tastes carefully inculcated during those museum trips and excursions to the theatre is an enormous advantage. But another is that when middle-class parents encourage their children to speak up for themselves, to talk to authority figures like teachers or doctors about what they want, they give their children what Leroux calls an emerging sense of entitlement. In adulthood, this expresses itself as a feeling of belonging and comfort, and a willingness to ask for what the individual wants or needs: special treatment, advice, a pay rise. Working class children, whose parents are less likely to have positive experiences with authority, don't develop the same sense that the adults that they interact with, like teachers or doctors, are ultimately there to help them achieve what they want. Instead, they develop an emerging sense of constraint, a feeling that places, roles, and opportunities aren't for the likes of them. In his book Dream Hoarders, the writer and former government advisor Richard Reeves points out a phenomenon known as opportunity hoarding. A lot of middle and upper class parenting is, consciously or unconsciously, about opening up opportunities for their children, which eventually will put that child on the inside track to success, wealth, and status. Everyone's story is important, and everyone's origins define them. I'm proud of my own story, and I know from experience that what you might lose in museum visits or tennis lessons, you gain in resilience, in the richness of coming from more than one culture, and in the pride of knowing that you survived. The profession that I have chosen is one in which the link between parents and children is particularly strong. The children of lawyers are 17 times more likely to become lawyers than are children not connected to the profession. When I ask some of my colleagues about their childhoods, they describe growing up in houses full of books, debates over the dinner table, perhaps even an excursion to watch mum or dad perform in court. That's not my story, but when I am in court, wearing the wig and gown that mark me out as a member of one of the oldest professions in my country's history, even, whisper it, a member of the establishment, I think of the people who came before me. My grandfather, who left the wilderness to build a new future for his family. My father, fluent in the many languages of the people whose paths he crossed in his travels. My mother, who gave birth to so many children over the course of her most formative years. And my grandmother, sitting in our overcrowded council flat in Wembley, so far away from where we started, spinning a golden web of proverbs, simile, and metaphor, as she told me the story of our family. In April 1993, just a few months before my arrival in England, a young black teenager was stabbed to death in a racially motivated attack while waiting for a bus in Eltham, in southeast London. The murder of Stephen Lawrence was a seminal moment for any young black man growing up in London at the time. I remember my auntie, a real matriarch and the mother of 6 boys, laying down some new rules. No hanging around in the streets like we used to in our Nairobi suburb, because, she said, they kill black boys in this country. It was my first experience of being a minority. In Kenya, race wasn't an issue. We, and everyone we knew, were black. For the first time, we were coming to see ourselves as different and realizing that in our strange new country, the way we looked marked us out and made us vulnerable. None of us is just one thing. All of us are composed of constellations of overlapping identities that together form who we are. We might see ourselves simultaneously as a brother, a fiancé, an uncle, a Liverpool fan, a graduate, a petrolhead, a Scouser, a Virgo. But over all these infinite variations loom two great categories that shape our identities and our futures like no other in modern Britain: race and class. England, George Orwell wrote, is the most class-ridden country under the sun. It is a land of snobbery and privilege, ruled largely by the old and silly. Class pervades every aspect of British society. It shapes the lives of its members in ways that are both profound and ordinary, from their life expectancy to their brand of tea bags. My family, arriving from Isli, a poverty-stricken suburb of Nairobi, were dropped into the middle of a vastly complex, rigidly structured society that we didn't understand and which itself had trouble categorizing us. We were definitely poor, but we knew nothing of British working-class culture or history. We lived in London, but we weren't Londoners. Apart from the colour of our skin, we didn't have much in common with other, more established ethnic groups, like Nigerians or Pakistanis. We also had no way to tell other people where we belonged. We barely spoke English. The difference between napkin and serviette was lost on us. We knew absolutely nothing about Britain, and the most basic facts about life here were entirely new to us. A few weeks after we arrived, I knocked myself unconscious by walking into a lamppost. I simply wasn't expecting it to be there. There wasn't street lighting in Isli, and I'd never seen a lamppost before. We groped about in total darkness, helpless to do anything about it. But if my family's immigrant experience was partly one of alienation and anxiety, it also coexisted with a feeling of belonging that, when we did experience it, was intoxicating. In 1987, Diane Abbott, Keith Vaz, Bernie Grant and Paul Boateng broke huge barriers to become the first people of colour elected to the House of Commons. Paul Boateng, who is of Ghanaian and Scottish heritage, was our MP. At that time, my family's immigration status was precarious, and we'd had little luck with our attempts to rally dodgy lawyers and a non-responsive Home Office to our cause. I was 15 at the time, and in a last-ditch attempt to get some help, I attended a constituency surgery in Harlesden Library. Carrying a plastic bag full of papers, I sat patiently, waiting for my turn to be seen, not quite sure what to expect. As it turned out, I didn't get to speak to Paul Boateng directly, but I did manage to catch his eye, and he returned an acknowledgement. It was a tiny moment, but one that mattered enormously to me. From that point on, a sense of place and of direction slowly became a reality. A sense that this representative, this man, who looks like me, is here to help me, help us, towards belonging here, towards citizenship and proper roots in this country. Since the late 1990s, Britain has experienced high levels of migration. Between 2004 and 2017, the foreign-born population in the UK nearly doubled, increasing from around 5.3 million to just under 9.4 million. Despite the fact that these immigrant and ethnic minority groups face many of the same obstacles and difficulties experienced by disadvantaged white Britons, a fault line between race and class has opened up in our national conversation. There is a persistent tendency in British society to behave as if race and class are different categories, or worse, mutually exclusive and competing ones. The idea that there is a fundamental separation between minorities and the white working class, and that the interests of those two groups are in direct conflict, is nothing new. It is now over 50 years since the Conservative Member of Parliament Enoch Powell delivered his Rivers of Blood speech, in which he sought to describe the change taking place in the country in the wake of the arrival of the Windrush generation from the Caribbean. But the working class has always been more diverse than our image of it. And in terms of the challenges they faced securing a decent life and opportunities for themselves, Powell's white constituents probably had more in common with their black neighbours than with the middle-class white people with whom they shared a heritage and a skin tone. This isn't to say that ethnicity isn't important. The challenges posed by your socioeconomic status can be compounded by your ethnicity. This is what is meant by the term intersectionality, that our separate identities do not operate independently, but interact to produce unique benefits or challenges. Take me as an example. I am a tall black man in my 30s. At the weekend, or if I'm on my way back from the gym, I might wear a hoodie. And if I get on the tube like this, I quite often notice the person next to me pull their bag tighter towards them, or move it from the floor to their lap. Either consciously or unconsciously, something about me makes them think I might steal their possessions. But the same thing doesn't happen when I'm coming home from court wearing a suit, and my middle-class white friends seem to be able to use public transport while wearing a tracksuit without being treated like potential muggers. So the particular form of racism I'm experiencing is to do with being black and young and male and wearing clothes that people associate with a particular section of society. My different identities together unite to form a new kind of identity that disadvantages me. Despite the fact that I have been liberally using the term, class is notoriously hard to define. Jobs are an important marker of class, but a university lecturer might proudly boast of their working class roots, while a plumber might send their children to a private school. Immigrants, and especially refugees, often lose significant social status when they leave their original country, but not always in a straightforward way. In Somalia, my family had been connected to a well-established and respected clan, and although in England we were very much at the bottom of the heap, among the Somali community in London we retained a certain cachet. To my mind, the best way to define class is in terms of access to privilege, opportunities, and representation in elite institutions and professions. Viewed like this, it becomes clear that the bottom tier of society have much more in common with each other than with people of their own ethnicity further up the social scale. Working class jobs are done by both the white working class and the BAME working class. They face similar barriers of resources, send their children to the same schools, and are affected by similar kinds of prejudice and the same paralyzing lack of knowledge about how to get on. In the years after our arrival in London, I would often walk with my aunt or grandmother to a place called Mahatma Gandhi House in the London borough of Brent, where we would ask for the family to be rehoused in decent accommodation. Our fellow travellers, with whom we shared both the waiting rooms and our predicament, were a diverse bunch. White Londoners, whose families had lived in the area for generations, newly arrived Somalis, second-generation Bangladeshis and Jamaicans. We were not in fierce competition with each other, but at the mercy of a dysfunctional and uncompassionate system. in creating a narrative that pits them endlessly against minorities, a disservice has been done to the white working class, who are all too often portrayed as racist, intolerant, and jealous. But as a 2017 report for the Runnymede think tank points out, it's not the white working class who make people with African and Asian sounding names send in twice as many CVs. It's not the white working class who award white British graduates nearly 3 times as many firsts as black British graduates. And it's not the white working class who design budgets that make the poorest black and Asian women some £2,000 worse off. You may have noticed that I've been dancing around a subject that has a particularly vexed history in British society: integration. The idea of integration has been used as a stick to beat immigrants with for many decades. It has all too often meant stripping immigrant communities of their culture, their religion, and their identity in order to retain the supposedly pure and undiluted character of the culture that they are joining. The imperative to integrate cannot be something that sits solely on the shoulders of the immigrant. The rest of society has a duty to shape itself so that it is welcoming to those who wish to join in. For me, integration is more about the feeling one has towards society, being invested in it, willing to support the whole of that society, being prepared to sacrifice for it, having every right to criticize it, seeing yourself or people like you feature in every echelon, and seeing your children's future in the same place where you've grown up. The failing state schools of inner city London during the 1990s were wild places. I was 14 when my head teacher was beaten almost unconscious in the school playground. This was only shocking because it happened inside the school grounds. Violence and sometimes death were common occurrences in our borough at the time, and many of us were living in extreme deprivation and in dangerous, unpredictable environments. Our aspirations were limited to the 2 professions in which we saw young black men making money: football and drug dealing. The level of disruption was such that at one point we had a resident police officer, in theory to teach us about law and order, but in practice more often a first responder. In short, we were a failing school. The school was failing us, and society was failing the school and us. Schools in London are very different places today, though they still deal with many of the same problems as they did during my school days. Poverty, disadvantage, and prejudice are every bit as much a part of our society as they ever were. It is true that any successful society must seek to educate its population to be literate and numerate, to broaden people's minds and prepare them for the modern world. Yet a cruel paradox is at work. Education is vital for social mobility, but being highly educated does not guarantee that you will be socially mobile. Having A-levels and a degree does not necessarily free you from the effects of disadvantage. Even when young people from deprived backgrounds do everything that is asked of them, stay in school, get good A-levels, beat the odds to get into a Russell Group university, they still lag behind better off fellow students. Even if their time at university is stunningly successful, it won't necessarily translate into the same benefits that students from privileged backgrounds enjoy. In their recent book, The Class Ceiling, Sam Friedman and Daniel Lorison note that even between graduates of the same university, in the same subject, graduates from well-off backgrounds but with unimpressive degrees still did better professionally than working-class graduates with firsts. Clearly, education cannot bear the weight of expectation that is placed on it. Something is at work that education itself does not resolve. Middle and upper middle class children are groomed from an early age to thrive in large institutions, have positive impressions of authority figures, and can articulate their needs clearly. A US study on social mobility in 2018 showed that by the age of 4, a child from a professional family will hear 45 million words, a working class child 26 million words, and a child on welfare only 13 million. A gap of 30 million words. While middle-class children arrive at school having been prepared for it, and perhaps familiar with the activities they will be doing there, for children from low-income backgrounds, school can be an alienating and intimidating experience. Ultimately, and unsurprisingly, the end result of all this is that poor children are vastly more likely to be permanently excluded from school. Using free school meals as a measure of disadvantage, we can see that by the time they are 14, right before their GCSEs, children on free school meals are 4 times more likely than their middle-class peers to be permanently excluded. This is what the statistics and the studies tell us. But I know what it's like on the inside, because I've lived it. In the first year of secondary school, still waiting for our asylum status to be resolved, sick of feeling like I had no ownership over my life, I became angry at everyone and everything all the time. I fought, disrespected, and disrupted the lives of my teachers and classmates, played truant and talked back. I was suspended 6 times over the course of 9 months, and at the end of that year, it was made clear that if I didn't leave of my own accord, I would be expelled on return. So I made an application to Wembley High, at the time the second worst school in the borough. I was perversely lucky in that once I got to Wembley High, my own bad behaviour was dwarfed by that of my new classmates, to the point that I no longer registered as particularly disruptive. But for many others, exclusion set them on the path to an early exit from education, woefully unprepared for the outside world. Young black boys are still being excluded from British schools, for reasons that are nominally to do with their behaviour, but are in reality more to do with childhood poverty and arguably an implicit racial bias in which black students are not perceived to have the same potential as their classmates. But it's also to do with the state of the education system, which forces schools to prioritize league tables at the expense of the children they are supposed to serve. If you wondered why exclusions among poor pupils spike before GCSEs, then this may well be your answer. Black boys, who are statistically more likely to underachieve at school, are victims of this in particular. Young boys, and increasingly girls, who are excluded from school are pushed out of an institution that could help them make sense of their lives and are likely to find that meaning instead on the streets. Gang members are 5 times more likely to have been excluded from school and are almost twice as likely to have some sort of emotional, social, or mental health problem. As the epidemic of knife and gun crime among young people continues, the same event that deprives them of the opportunity to better their lives also puts them at risk of losing it altogether. To talk about failing schools and exclusions is to address only half of the question. When the new Prime Minister Boris Johnson appointed a cabinet in July 2019, it was announced as the most diverse in history. Not in educational background, 67% of its members were privately educated, and 37% had attended both private school and Oxbridge. But while we are familiar with these statistics, we seem unable to really respond to the astonishing, paralyzing unfairness of the society they represent. The benefits of private education are not necessarily what you would expect. For a start, it's almost never about the results. Although private schools undoubtedly produce better results at both GCSE and A-level, the exam results gap between private and state schools have narrowed significantly in the last decade. So why do parents shell out the astronomical sums that private education costs? The economic capital held by these parents allows them to unlock two further forms of capital, both of which are crucial to social mobility: social capital and cultural capital. In essence, social capital is connections, friendships, and networks, while cultural capital is knowledge, behavior, and skills, how to behave, what to wear, and how to speak in certain circles. The result of all this social and cultural capital is another thing that parents are paying for, whether you call it polish, public school charm, or any of a number of other euphemisms. Its essence is confidence. It's the confidence to know you belong, the deep down sense that you matter, the opposite of the feeling that I had as a young, angry, lonely refugee. Given all this, it's not surprising that parents will bankrupt themselves to get their child access to such places. With private schooling, we have created a system that allows parents to purchase success for their children. We can hardly be horrified that they take it up. So what's the answer? Close down all the private schools? It's a solution that many would find tempting, but hardly a practical one, if only for the fact that it would involve many of the people in charge of education policy shutting down their own alma maters. To my mind, the answer is to concentrate on raising the standards of state schools to the point where they become the obvious choice. But to get there, we need to invest in our school system like never before, and to plan for a future that's very different from our own school days. If we can raise standards of the entire state sector, ensure that teachers aren't forced from the education system through stress and overwork, and get to a place where schools are genuinely socially diverse, we will be able to diminish the power of private school social networks to dominate the social mobility story. Much of what I have said is about the importance of education in a negative sense. What happens when it's disrupted, abandoned, or simply not there? But it is also true that the education system is full of inspired and inspiring people whose dedication can have a transformative effect on students, regardless of their circumstances. Halfway through my time at Wembley High School, when I was about 14 years old, one of my teachers took it upon herself to make an intervention just before we broke up for summer. Miss Adler told my class that she would be taking us on a trip to B&Q. It was the first time I had ever set foot in the place. At B&Q, Miss Adler asked us to pick 2 paint colours. She paid for the paint and equipment herself, and over the course of a week in the summer holiday, we cleaned and brushed down the walls of our form room and applied multiple coats of paint to the walls, blue, and the ceiling and borders, white. When school reconvened after the summer, we were full of pride at what we had achieved. You'd sometimes see one of us checking whether other kids who'd been in there had left marks on the walls. If they had, we'd carefully wipe them off. The moment that I walked back into that blue and white room, sat down, stared at the walls, and quietly whispered to myself, "This is my work," was the moment when I began to feel a part of this new society. A society that I was beginning to embrace, and felt it embracing me. It was the first feeling of genuine contribution to a society I could perhaps one day call my own. Just like that, I was hooked on this feeling. I wanted more of it. I wanted the feeling for myself, for my family, for my friends, for everyone, forever. When I was 18, I was homeless for a year. I had left school, and since I was no longer in full-time education, I had become eligible to pay council tax, something we didn't have a hope of affording. As a result, I ended up at Centrepoint in Soho, the hostel for young homeless people. At the time, the system was that you had a bed for the first 9 nights, but you had to use that time to secure your next hostel. This meant spending your early mornings ringing around anywhere that might have a spare bed, trying to persuade them that they should give it to you. Your next hostel would allow you to stay for 2 weeks, which you had to spend securing the next hostel, which would be fixed for 6 months, and so on. The stakes were high. If you couldn't secure somewhere, you'd be faced with a choice of a night on the streets or returning to the situation that you'd left behind. It was immediately clear to me that many of the young people I shared Centrepoint with were struggling. They lacked the confidence to make the calls in the first place, or they couldn't explain why they needed the bed in a way that made sense to the busy people on the other end of the phone. So once I had sorted out my own accommodation, I started calling on behalf of other people. It was the first time I'd ever done something like this, and I learned a valuable lesson about the importance of language and the power of knowing how to use your voice effectively. It's easy to see social mobility in terms of numbers, funding, budgets, quotas, percentages, and income gaps. But that's only half the story. The other half is harder to define, but it has to do with the effective use of language. If you can't articulate what you want to yourself or to others, if you can't connect with people and persuade them to offer you the things that you need, if you can't argue your way onto that very first rung of the ladder, the bed for the night, it's not going to count for much. I grew up bilingual in Somali and Swahili. When we moved to England, I found myself suddenly struggling, attending school in a language I didn't speak. When I did learn English, it was a form known as multicultural London English, the language of black inner city London in the 1990s, a society full of rich immigrant experience, influenced by Jamaican patois and grime music, marinated in the cultures of the South Asian Muslims and the African and Caribbean lives of my corner of northwest London. And I find myself today making a career out of speaking persuasively in the archaic and formalized language of the law courts. I still speak all these languages. On any given day, I might begin with a visit to my grandmother, where I listen as she waxes lyrical in Somali proverbs, head into court for a hearing, my lord. I am loath to interrupt my learned friend mid-flow, but would he care to continue reading the rest of the passage? Go to the BBC for a meeting. Before we touch base, let's make sure we've engaged the key stakeholders, and then meet my young cousin back in Wembley. Yo fam, what you saying though? I've seen for myself the many ways in which languages impact on success and happiness, As a recent immigrant, not speaking the language disrupted my education, isolated me, and undermined my confidence. I watched as Somali adults struggled to learn English and saw how difficult this made life for them, stopping them from being able to effectively communicate with authority figures and government departments. I saw how the ambitions of my friends and siblings were shaped and limited by the fact that they never heard anyone in authority speak like them. And I saw how, by changing how I communicated, I could change the way that people responded to me. Before I get onto the fraught nature of the relationship between language and class, one very important thing should be noted. Language skills are not shared out equally in our society. Children from privileged backgrounds are 18 months ahead of their poorer peers, even before they start school. Not being able to express yourself is itself intensely frustrating, leading to behavioral problems that affect not just children's education, but their relationships and happiness. Poor language skills in childhood are closely linked with difficulties in adulthood. 60% of young offenders struggle with it, and having a limited vocabulary as a child doubles your likelihood of being unemployed in adulthood. The way you speak is one of the most intensely personal things about you. It reflects the unique combination of circumstances that shaped you, and is a profound point of connection with the place and people you grew up around. It's unsurprising, then, that people often feel that the pressure to change their accent, whether direct or indirect, is an attempt to erase their identity. As a first-generation immigrant who learned English as a third language, part of my response to the way the British agonize over their accent is best described as puzzlement. But I have to admit that even if I view it with the perspective of an outsider, I am also a participant. I work in a profession where you rarely hear an accent that would be categorized as anything other than pure RP. I've never had voice coaching or elocution lessons, but my own accent has undoubtedly changed and continues to change depending on where I am and who I'm speaking to. I still live in the same neighborhoods I grew up in, but my voice is one that a colleague once remarked as being from the home counties. To me, though, this doesn't reflect compromises made or identity distorted as some might claim. It's hard to imagine how my original accent could be some profound expression of my inner self, given that it was formed by the quirk of fate that landed us in Wembley and not, say, Minnesota or Malmo. Instead, it shows the changes my life has undergone. I am an accent pragmatist. If the world changed tomorrow and everyone on the BBC and the High Court bench was speaking with a Scouser accent, I'd learn. The way we perceive certain accents is partly down to the kind of direct prejudice that Britain is steeped in, but it is compounded by the fact that we are naturally drawn to people who we perceive to be like us. In interviews and at work, gatekeepers who guard the social mobility checkpoints prefer candidates who seem like them, even if they don't consciously realize it. A high value is placed on someone who already speaks and expresses themselves like a lawyer, or doctor, or teacher. In other words, who sounds like the interviewer. This confronts the socially mobile person with a choice. Learn to speak the language of the world you want to join, or speak the way you've always spoken and take the consequences. The answer lies, for some people, in code switching. This is something all of us do fairly naturally, and it is fundamental to my own life. If you view different areas of life as having their own distinct linguistic registers, a more formal register for professional meetings, a boisterous, sweary register for a football match, then code switching is the term for the change between them. During my childhood, my mother, my aunt, and the other older relatives would struggle to get the simplest thing done for them at the housing office. The disdain they would be treated with is etched into my memory. Even now, I'll take the phone from my mother struggling to have a charge removed from her bill and hear the problem melt away in front of my voice. Is it fair? No. But it is effective. Code switching is difficult, tiring, and involves tolerating a fair amount of cognitive dissonance. I have constant battles with my young cousins, who are confirmed speakers of multicultural London English. To them, the way they speak is a form of language that has evolved around them and feels natural. Of course, they are right, and I understand the reluctance to adopt a way of speaking that feels foreign and perhaps uncomfortable, even just in the workplace. It is not fair that our society requires it of people who simply want to improve their circumstances. But neither is it fair to pretend to young people that they don't need to do it to get ahead. My young cousins do not set off every morning into a neutral world in which people are only interested in what they have to say, rather than the way they are saying it, no matter how awkward we might find it to admit. And given that being a young black man with a Muslim name in Britain is far from a neutral existence, why should those young men compound the issue by sticking rigidly to just one linguistic register? The answer lies, it seems to me, in encouraging range and flexibility in a way that reflects both our current landscape, with its shibboleths and prejudices, and the more open and tolerant place it could become. Young people should be given the opportunity to speak the language of elite institutions, which they may never have encountered. But we should also jettison the damaging idea that there is one single right form of the language. Exposing young people as early as possible to unfamiliar contexts, voices, and accents, to people and environments who are very different to those of their upbringing, gives them the opportunity and the tools to decide for themselves. Evolve or die. If nothing else, my family's journey has been a reminder of this. Language is at the heart of the social mobility story in Britain, but the person speaking is only half the equation. The other half is the person listening. Theirs is the task of changing that world, of freeing themselves from baked-in ideas about what constitutes intelligence or professionalism. We must challenge not only ourselves, but one another, not to be guided by prejudice, to judge people on what they are saying and not on how they are saying it. We need to be more imaginative, more acutely self-aware when we are making those instantaneous judgments about others, and look beyond the voice to what is actually being said. I believe that once we get to a place where young people are trained and encouraged to be articulate, where they can deploy a wide vocabulary with a clarity of thought and are armed with new and exciting ideas, then we might be in a position to reshape the current linguistic landscape in favor of social, cultural, and ethnic diversity. Perhaps then we will have found a way of neutralizing prejudices instead of playing right into them. Perhaps then we will have conquered another corner of the social mobility story and moved one step closer to a more equal society. In the summer of 2002, the The restlessness that had been building inside me over the preceding decade reached a peak. I had some fairly mediocre A-levels that had somehow got me a place at the University of Hertfordshire. But I wasn't convinced this was the answer for me. A life on the streets in Brent was easily available, and while I never seriously considered it, I remember thinking I would probably be good at it. These guys getting caught on the street corners were making such elementary mistakes, I thought. Clearly, something had to change. The starting point for me came the following year, when I became a naturalized British citizen. For the first time in my life, I could travel anywhere I wanted. My status was no longer precarious. I was no longer simply a refugee in limbo, a citizen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I had a new country, on paper at least. Whether I belonged to it, though, remained an open question. I was overtaken by a powerful urge to go back to Kenya, to the place we had left and where my father was buried. So in August 2003, I boarded a plane bound for Nairobi. I was met by a distant uncle and his wife at the airport. This uncle had left for Germany a few years before the war had broken out and had returned in the mid-1990s to set up a business in Nairobi. Together with his Somali-German wife, he began selling second-hand electronics and mobile phones, just as the popularity of mobile banking began to boom in Kenya. Combining the Somali entrepreneurial spirit with German efficiency, they became very wealthy. The next morning, I met my cousin Guled, who attended the private German school in Nairobi. A few hours later, his friends came, keen to meet the son of Mohammed Hashi Mohamed, once a famous local whose life was taken away too soon. These were dynamic young men, carrying multiple passports and leading privileged lives in Africa. I was in awe of them, but I also felt sick, remembering the humiliating reality of the past decade in Britain. I remember thinking, what have I done with my life thus far? Why do I not speak more languages like them? Why am I not as well-travelled as them? I saw these young men make the best of their talents in a way I had always thought was never meant to happen for me. On returning to Britain, I realized three things. First, I was not going back anywhere. When I went to Nairobi, I went to collect what I had left behind 10 years before. My thoughts, my consciousness, my confidence. The clock would start from zero now. Secondly, I had survived the worst thing that life could throw at me, the death of my father. But I had survived it. Nothing, no job rejection, no breakup, no other tragedy would ever be as bad. I came back unafraid to fail and determined to make the most of what I did have. I had a lot of catching up to do. Thirdly, I felt an opening up of my horizons. The absence of expectation was a liberating force. It meant that I could try my hand at anything and see if it worked. And if it failed, it didn't matter because nobody was even expecting me to try. At this point in my life, I had never met a barrister, let alone known what it took to become one. But I started my undergraduate degree in law and French at the University of Hertfordshire. I spent 9 months in France as an Erasmus scholar and became fluent in French. I tried my luck at Oxford for postgraduate studies and was accepted with a full scholarship. Then, again on a full scholarship, I started bar school in London and secured pupillage at one of the top sets of chambers in the country. Among the poor and underprivileged communities where I grew up, imagining a better future often seemed simply impossible. We were mainly focused on staying alive and out of trouble. Our ambitions and imaginations were shaped by our circumstances. We didn't have much sense of what sort of things we could do beyond what we saw in our own families. But when I did leave and found myself among the better off, I encountered a corresponding inability to see beyond existing stereotypes, to reimagine what a chairman of the board, or a senior partner, or a promising new trainee might look like. Throughout my career, I've come across similar attitudes. The people who hold them aren't necessarily hostile. In fact, often they are admiring and supportive. But they experience me as an anomaly, something to be interrogated and explained. It's the mirror image of an unquestioning acceptance that a certain kind of person, middle class, well-spoken, highly educated, white, is the basic model candidate for elite professions. So if you are a young person from a background like mine, seeking to become socially mobile, what's the answer? At the heart of what's happened for me, and for people like me, is the ability to imagine a better place for oneself. That doesn't mean the kind of imagination that consists of closing your eyes and praying very hard. It doesn't mean a willful refusal to accept the nature of reality. But it doesn't mean limiting your ambitions either. Instead, it's the kind of imagination that sits alongside a clear perception of the challenges and sees a way through them, as well as grit and resilience that allows you to keep going when things get tough. The question of imagination is twofold. It is about how someone sees themselves and how the rest of the world sees them. Feeling like an outsider can be deeply alienating, and for someone who looks visibly different, the opportunities to blend in, to simply get on with the job without distractions, are few and far between. The part of your identity that marks you as different can come to dominate all others. For women who wear the hijab, as some of my sisters, my nieces, and my mother do, this one element of their identity, that of the Muslim woman, can easily become dominant and magnified to the point that it takes over everything else. Very little room is left to explore or express anything of their other identities. Female, African, a Londoner, a student, a mother, a professional. Many other people from marginalized groups find themselves similarly forced into a particular box. Their identity defined by others and not in a way that benefits them. Muslim women may find themselves stereotyped as passive, oppressed, unworldly. Young black men as aggressive, uncooperative, even criminal. Poor white men as crude, lazy, feckless. It's not surprising that in response a movement has started that has attempted to push back against the weight of expectation, to bring people experiencing similar kinds of oppression together to seek solidarity and support in numbers. I am talking, of course, about what has been termed identity politics. The impetus for people who share a particular trait, gender, race, sexuality, religion, to band together politically in order to exert pressure in their common interests. These things are important, of course, from the suffragettes to Black Lives Matter and the campaigns to legalize gay marriage. Movements based on identity have changed the global conversation and pushed the rights of oppressed groups to the forefront of government policy. They have given people a vocabulary to talk about difficult subjects and an insight into the lives and experiences of others. But I cannot ignore the suspicion that at heart, both identity politics and the kind of structural lack of imagination that keeps people like me from progressing have something in common. They both encourage people to see themselves in terms of a single, disadvantageous aspect of their rich and varied individuality. Identity politics insists that I must see myself as a black Muslim immigrant, and that my identity will therefore always be in conflict with the world in which I now find myself. All too often, the way in which politics is presented to minority or marginalized groups is as an endless competition between special interests, as if there's only a certain amount of oxygen available. The truth is that we are all in this together. Growing up, my siblings and I had more in common with white working class kids in Stoke or Dagenham than we ever did with a black Etonian. Of course, people who aren't in privileged positions should be conscious of the odds against them and of their right to demand something different. But ultimately, what we need is for people to see the similarities between them, to form meaningful relationships and dialogue. Instead, we have division and suspicion, caution and shame, pointless minority networks and diversity boards set up by businesses, rather than active, organic networks of people sharing information. Success is, to a great extent, an act of redefining what is familiar and in the process transforming it. It is, in a way, an act of imagination. To me, one of the fundamental ways in which we can use imagination to reshape social mobility in the UK is to rethink what we mean by success, to redefine aspiration, and change how aspiration is rewarded. Success is a lifelong journey to discover what we are good at, to improve on it, and to find ways of doing less of what we do not enjoy, or identifying early on what may not come so naturally to us. Success isn't a zero-sum game, but we live in a world that tells us it is, that money is a measure of value, that a nurse is less successful than a lawyer, that a valuable person fits into a certain kind of mold. To make social mobility about attaining a particular portfolio of jobs, possessions, and status is to misunderstand, in my view, what human progress is about. A more equal society is one that can give its citizens space to find their own definition of success. Instead of a narrow winner-takes-all mentality, we could find something that rewards and sees as a genuine end in itself jobs that support others, strengthen our society from within, where compassion and generosity are qualifications as valuable as intelligence and drive. For some, happiness will always be linked with material possessions. For some, it will be about power and status. But for others, it will be about a happy family, love, belonging, or about making a difference, creating a change. We could build a society that values all these outcomes equally, but we will need to use our imaginations.